Hi, everyone. This is For the Love of Comics with special guest Chris Parry from the fantastic YouTube channel Off My Shelves. Chris, a very warm welcome to the show.
Oh, hello, and thank you very much for the invite. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you. And Chris, we'll be talking about a number of comics and giving our opinions on them soon enough. But I just wanted to start by saying what a pleasure it is to have you on the show. I've been enjoying your channel from the very beginning, I think, from your Hellboy and Usagi videos, which might have been your first couple, but I've also been fortunate enough to have been featured on your channel, specifically in your Dark Horse and Image comics celebrations. So you have these comic spotlights, but you also have these publisher spotlights on your channel.
Yeah, you were one of the first people I got in touch with, because a lot of my Dark Horse comics, you did kind of influence. Hellboy has kind of always been my discovery and my little world, but then all the other bits like Usagi and loads of other creators actually you kind of put me on to, like Jason and Tardy and other things. So yeah, I am in your debt more than anything. Thank you very much for the compliments as well. Very kind of it. Same to you, but I don't want to like make you have a bigger head because you go,
no, it's tight enough already.
Now you're a proper influencer now.
Yes, indeed. I also appreciate the effort that you take in your videos, your editing, with your scripting, with even your color grade and the look of your videos, which have gone through a couple of iterations.
Yeah, I've gone kind of up and down. Like I went from being very lo-fi to being quite hi-fi and high-tech, and back to lo-fi again, and probably keep going in. Now I'm in a very like we've talked about in the past, in the mood for like lots of natural lighting and trying to not script as much, if at all, really. Like you'll only see me scripting probably like my look backs at Hellboy and one or two other videos, but the rest is kind of just mainly off the cuff.
Which is a perfect fit for today, because this is not a scripted video, although we have some sort of a framework. Chris, you want to tell our viewers, although they'll have some sort of an idea with the title and the thumbnail, why don't you let them know what exactly it is that we are embarking upon here?
We are embarking into unknown territory, really. And basically, you came up with an idea a while ago when you invited me on your channel, so long ago now, I can't even remember when it was. And the concept was music, comics, or music in comics, or, music and comics being connected in some way, and looking at books that have that, tight connection. And I think me being a guitarist and a musician inspired you to do that, because you not a musician, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, as far away as possible, while still appreciating music.
And so I think you thought like having those two dynamics, a musician and a non-musician talking about music books and music comics would be interesting. And so that's what we're kind of going to do. We're going to look at comic books and graphic novels mainly that are connected to music in some way.
And it's such a simple, short little topic that I'm sure, will be done in about 10 minutes or so. Is that what we're estimating here?
Right. They already know. They're looking at the timeline.
Right, that's right. That's right. They can already see this. But
how many books have they got?
We're going to really test the limits of natural lighting. I encourage everyone to make comparisons of before and after the beginning of the video and at the later end of the video.
You'll just see a reflection of my glasses on the street light.
That's very moody. We've got comics that we're going to talk about. So the approach we're taking over here is our top 5 music comics. And the reason I put a question mark over there is that's probably how I am, for clickbait reasons, going to title and thumbnail this video. But would you be comfortable classifying the comics that you're talking about today? Because I'll say right now, I'm not necessarily 100% on this, as your personal top 5 ranked comics.
I know that as soon as this question entered your head, you had a few comics, but then you instantly undercut those and tried to discover, like some sort of ancient archaeologist, discover the real, what is music in comics? I was quite quick and easy on this one, because there are relatively few comics that I defined that are on my shelves and that I've read multiple times and enjoyed, that I would class as, having music at the center of that story and that narrative. But yeah, mine are definitely in order. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the number one pick is the number one pick, and so on and so forth. Whereas you, it's broad.
Right. I see that you know me well because first of all, I always have trouble ranking no matter what. But also boiling it down to just 5 comics, I agree with you. My initial reaction was, well, I'm going to talk about comics that have music as an integral part of them, not just that have music in them. Everything from Asterix to Love and Rockets can feature music in some way, but is it integral to the story? Is it integral to the comic's identity and the reason why it exists? I too thought there aren't going to be that many, so it'll be easier. But yes, I did end up with many more than 5. And this is where I think the only time in our discussions on how we're going to approach this, I think the only time you put your foot down really was to say no honorable mentions allowed.
Yes. I wanted you to refine yourself and constrain yourself because you adore the medium so much and want to give all these people props as well. You adore the caveat of, oh, well, I can just mention it in an honorable mention. But no, you can't now. We're banning that. You only got 5, so you have to really knuckle down. That's it more than anything.
And that's what I've had to do. I'm a little disappointed to hear that it wasn't as much of a tribulation for you as it was for me. You know, I feel we should have suffered equally, but you seem to have had not just an easier time of putting 5 together, but you even have them ranked, which is something I'm sure all of us are really looking forward to. And in the absence of honorable mentions,
you'll squeeze them in.
Yes,
you'll squeeze them in. You're going to ignore that ruling and squeeze in an extra book here and there.
I think everyone can now see how far I can stray and how quickly Chris can rein me back in. But of course, we'll all be looking for suggestions from all of you as well in the comments for those who are watching. And I'm looking forward to getting recommendations from you, Chris, on comics that I haven't encountered before, as I'm sure both of us are looking forward to what people leave in the comments. And even though I think both of our viewerships are positive, they do like a little bit of gentle ribbing. So I'm sure some of them might even take like, how could you leave this out? Which is a traditional danger with making lists.
I know already there's going to be one that the few of them will probably say, how could you take that out?
Maybe at the end of this, we can put down our guesses. We did mention to each other what our 5 comics were going to be, just out of curiosity, but also we didn't want to have any overlaps and intersections in which we both picked the same comic. However, Chris, it didn't happen. We didn't have any intersections, which I think is great.
There was only one that I picked that you said that was possible. For the rest, yeah, it was all different.
We already mentioned how we want music to be integral. Are there any other parameters or any other approach that you added when making your selection of comics?
The integral bit was the main thing. Like we said to each other on the messenger and stuff like that, you know, music has to be at the heart of it. So whether that's music culture, music creation, you know, a biography or non-fiction, you know, if you remove music from it, then the book kind of doesn't exist really.
Right.
And whether it might even be like a backdrop. You know, a few of my books, music and musical culture, is a backdrop to the main story, but it's still an integral backdrop. I'll compare it to, like, you know, Lord of the Rings has got like a load of music and poetry in it, but if you were to remove the music and the songs, you would still have Lord of the Rings. The narrative wouldn't change drastically. But if you were to do removing the music and the musicality of these books, then you wouldn't really have a book. And so that was my approach to it, is that it had to be a fundamental part of the story, really.
How does it break down for you? Do you find yourself with more fiction and more non-fiction, or is it evenly balanced? I guess it's 5, so we can't have an absolute even balance.
Way back when, though, when you mentioned it, I instantly assumed it was going to be quite heavy on the biographical side of things. But my 5 have actually transpired to be more of the fictional world, where 3 of them are not biographical at all and only 2 of them are biographical.
We seem to have 3 biographies and 2 works of fiction. So I'd say that's pretty close. Between the 2 of us, we have 5 fiction and 5 non-fiction.
That's great.
Yeah, 50-50.
See, that worked out well. It's like we planned that.
But we didn't. The integrity of this entire process is somehow arbitrarily very, very important to us. When I think about film, cinema, television, I can see how music would be used because you can hear the music as part of the medium. Whereas with prose, it's much harder to try to capture the sense or the essence of music. A question that I had was, is comics slightly better equipped, or is it slightly easier in comics than it is in prose? It definitely won't be as easy as film.
Oh, definitely not. But what it does is it creates something that's incredibly unique to the person, isn't it, really? Because if I give you a book that's about music, for example, and you read it and there's, like, say, a band playing on stage. Now, there'll be certain effects and certain word bubbles or maybe even musical notes on the page to imply the music is happening in that scene. And so your brain will have a musical backdrop of some kind. It might be a quick snapshot, it might be a long, but your experience is totally different from mine. And the author, when they were writing that and painting that in the first place, had a different song in mind as well. And so it's a very unique way of kind of putting sound on, because it leaves it down to the individual to kind of create, but it relies on a lot of learned knowledge about what a guitar sounds like, what a piano sounds like, what a violin sounds like, what drums sound. So if you've grown up in the world, obviously you've got a lot of that with you. You know, you know that, and it's kind of a natural thing that you've got. And so when you see those soundless images, you can associate your own personal sound to it. And so it's really uniquely different from, you know, film and TV and all that, because it's a personal experience. You know, it can't be duplicated between any other people, which is quite weird when you think about it.
I think that's one of the things that comics also has. Everyone's line is a little different. Therefore, you always have individuality, and that's, I think, what makes comics so good at autobiography and at biography. It kind of gets you closer to a separate individual skin rather than it being something more generic. So I think one of the things that we'd like to keep an eye out for is how is the comics part of it working with the music part of it? Like, what is the book that we're talking about? What is it doing with music in comics form that is so striking to us?
Using those little tricks like lettering and like little tricks we'll get to, I'm sure, but, you know, using those to help the reader understand the type of music that's going on. But again, a lot of it is so reliant on that learned knowledge that you hopefully have just by being alive. You know, it's not overcomplicated visual language, but it does definitely rely on you doing some of the work imaginatively, which is great.
Let's get on with providing specific examples of exactly what we're talking about, because this is a fantastic area of discussion. And I'm sure that even after however lengthy this conversation is, there will be a lot left to keep following up and talking on. So without further ado, Chris, why don't you kick us off by telling us what your number 5 pick is?
Number 5 is probably my most predictable one. I picked this not for the obvious reasons, though, which I'll get to in a second, and it is Scott Pilgrim. Now, not just the one book, the whole series. So this is obviously volume 1 of a 6-volume set. And I know lots of people probably picked up the collector's edition box set. Have you grabbed that? Or is it in your sister's waiting for you?
No. I have the black and whites and the colors, and that's good enough for me.
I voted, but it got cancelled. So I got saved, and I was like, right. I couldn't afford it anyway.
Would that have been a triple dip? You have the black and white digests as well?
No. I was going to buy the black and white hardback version box set. But the place I bought it from cancelled it.
I see. The box set is black and white, is it?
There's two. There's a colour and a black and white.
I didn't know there was a black and white box set. My answer made
black and white. Scott Pilgrim, for me, obviously people will naturally see this and see Scott as a musician and see him in his band and see the battles that happen and the battle of the bands that happen later and think that it's quite a normal, easy pick. Oh yeah, that's about music. But for me, it's what it depicts musically in a different way. When I grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, I was in bands. bands, and I was living a life that was not too dissimilar to Scott Pilgrim. I didn't have to fight evil exes or anything like that.
Were you dating a high schooler?
No, sadly, no. I would have dated anyone. No one wanted me. The life that they lay out, this kind of almost kind of stoner life of just lazing around, playing computer games, listening to music, and going to band practice, seeing other bands out on the same circuit as you locally, talking to them, watching them play, having jealousy, thinking, oh, how they are good and you were not, and then learning from them, and having local kids and young people come to your band practice and think it's the most amazing thing they've ever seen. And so it's the world that Scott lives within is why it resonates so much with me. And it is such a central thing about music. I mean, music, and particular garage bands and music culture, is created in very similar ways to this. It just is young people getting together and trying to be creative. And this captures the mundanity of that, but also the beauty of it as well, the kind of the relaxation bit of it, but the bit that you feel like you're at home, like you're with your people. And music has such an ability to do that. And being in a band and being a musician has such a strong ability to do that. The other great thing about this with music-wise is I think, and I'm sure I'm not remembering this wrongly, is that it was the first book that I saw that actually had musical chords as well as vocals on the page. And when I saw that, I thought it was lovely because I could literally put the book down on the table and play the song that they are putting across in the book. I mean, it's this page here, and you can see the music coming off in these lightning shapes and things like that. And it even gives the chord shapes and structures there, G, C, E minor, and then above each word and line going there. And even knives at the top here, like that was me just going to my friends' bands practice and just going, oh, I'm nowhere near that good. I want to be, they're amazing. Just being just enamored with what you're seeing in that culture. You remove that element of Scott Pilgrim and the whole book falls apart because, you might read it and think, oh, it's this amazing story of Scott Pilgrim, quite fantastical, falling in love, fighting these evil exes and all that. But his whole life and his whole social sphere that he's in revolves around music, and his personality is defined by being a bassist and being in a band. It means so much to him and so much to his life. And so that's why it was quite a natural pick to me, because it does such a good job of depicting that world that a lot of people who play instruments and being in bands would have familiarity with, even people who are, going to band practices and doing these types of things. And even most of the fights take place in band venues. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so the whole narrative of the book is so closely linked to music and music culture that it was a no-brainer to me because I love it so much. So that was my first pick, number 5.
Great pick. And that was one that as soon as you mentioned it to me, that was the one where I'm like, yes, of course. It's interesting that you say that. Maybe my reaction was, because there's so much music in it, but you're quite right. That seems to seep into every single aspect of their lives. To me, not having had that culture, not having had that, I saw it purely on metaphorical terms. I mean, I got the culture that they were talking about, but the way that you have an ex who used to be in a band with you, and then the breakup is also represented in her new band, is much bigger and is famous and they're on tour and you're still in this small little garage band, so you've moved on to bigger and better things and I'm still stuck where I was as a Arrested Development man-child sort of thing in that story. Did you find that particularly affecting in a way, because I thought it was affecting, but is there an added sting to it for you as a musician?
You either go one or two ways. You either think the Envy's band is the goal, or being lo-fi and unappreciated like Scott is the goal. And I think I was like Scott in terms of, I don't even want a music deal, even though I probably did. I don't want to be appreciated. I just want to make music, man. And so I think there's probably this kind of almost like rebellious thing that and I think Scott has it in this book where he does look at Envy Adams' band with both kind of lenses on. Like often he's looking at them kind of jealous about their success and not understanding how they've got it. but then equally looking at it kind of like, oh, well, I don't need it anyway. But I think him looking at it and not understanding is great, because when you're in a band and you love your music and love the things you're creating, when you see another local band make it, you genuinely can't understand why ain't we up there then? What's going on there? Because you so into it. It's you versus the world. It really is. And when you're in that kind of mindset, is that type of thinking is quite natural. But I love it. I think it does a great job of depicting what it's like to be in a band, what it's like to be that age, even kind of more the homemade stuff, like booking your own gigs and being unsuccessful, having gigs in your mates' houses, doing your own posters and your own CDs and stuff like that. This kind of homemade lo-fi band that's never going to be massive, but it means everything to you, no matter what Scott does. To Kim or to the other member. Why is his name gone out of my head? The guitarist.
Stephen Stills?
Yeah. How did I forget that?
Well, he's the talent.
Exactly. He is the talent. So even when they hate Scott, they all still have total love for each other. They're annoyed as hell for each other, but they are loyal as hell to each other as well, no matter what they do to each other. And again, that is what it's like. It really is. So it does a great job of capturing that, I think. And it definitely makes me appreciate the experiences I went through far more now, in hindsight, looking back to it. You had no concept of what it was like or anything like that. But those kind of days gone by, you look at them and you go, yeah, that was pretty good. And we were like that, and we did this and we did that.
Great pick. In tone and style, it's a stark contrast to your pick. My first pick is Johnny Cash, I See a Darkness, written and drawn by Reinhard Kleist. And Chris, you and I have both talked about Osterheld and Breccia's Life of Che, and it's called an impressionistic biography. That's the subtitle that Fantagraphics gave it. And that's kind of how I would describe this as well. Although alongside being an impressionistic biography, it's also a very expressionistic biography that takes a range of styles, all in this very inky, stark and noir style to represent this legendary musician. And I really love Reinhard Kleist's art style. It reminds me of the sort of jagged work that I appreciate in Nate Powell and Amy de Jong's work, but also in some cases it's so sketchy and so rectangular and angular that it reminds me even of Matt Kint's art, which has a definite angular stylization to it. It uses this style perfectly to tell a very noir tinged story. So it's this German expressionistic impression story, which is made up of vignettes. It does not try to be comprehensive, but also in this very American gangster noir style, bringing this tone to the Johnny Cash biography that seems to be drawing as much from the persona of his songs as it does from the man behind it. So part of it is that performance of that character, and the other is the sort of damage that he takes from it, either as a consequence or parallel to it. And I thought it did a fantastic job of creating a very varied portrait of a person where the complexity isn't just, oh, he's got contradictions. It's about the darkness, and it's about that seedy, almost criminal underbelly, but done as far as within a person rather than as an exterior environment. The only thing about this is this is my, not number 5 in rank, but this was the last book to be added to my list because it was in serious competition with Reinhard Kleist, the same writer and artist, his biography of Nick Cave, Mercy on Me, which I think is the equal of Johnny Cash, I See a Darkness. And picking one of those two for this list was one of my tough choices. But either way...
Watching, by the way, that was counted as an honourable mention. For anyone taking score, put the honourable mention, illegal honourable mention, counter up to 1.
I didn't even get to my number 4 book. Straight off the bat is where I failed. I think this is a very interesting way of depicting a life. I've seen the Hollywood movie representation with Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon.
Does the book then deal with the same time frame for the majority in terms of him finding fame and then struggling with addiction and anger and emotional issues, and then kind of walk away from that? Or does it take him right the way to, like the vignettes you said, where do they kind of finish off him?
They finish off with his death. So I think the Rick Rubin produced the leaner, more stripped down songs, of which his cover of Hurt obviously is a big famous one, but also his cover of I See a Darkness, which is a much more contemporary song. It goes all the way up to him being that age and sort of looking back on his life and why these songs speak to him. So it goes all the way there, but it also has a substantial portion spent on his childhood and his older brother Jack, who was his favorite, and the sort of tragedy and darkness over there and where he comes from. So in some ways, it is more stretched out, but it just gets into one sequence and stays there for a while and then skips forward or backwards sometimes in time. The only thing that really connects it in some ways is the Folsom County Prison performance. Not the performance itself, but the fact that there was a prisoner who, when he heard that Johnny Cash was going to be singing there, managed to smuggle out to him a song that he wrote and that he really wanted Johnny Cash to sing. And it's that song whose lyrics keep coming up throughout the book, particularly at the end. They come back, and the story of that inmate is a sort of parallel thematic thing. This notion of why did Johnny Cash speak to people. I've heard, of course, a number of his most famous songs, but I'm not a collector of his records and I don't have any scholarship over his albums. But you, Chris, I believe, are a Johnny Cash fan.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And again, the Folsom Prison Blues album and probably the San Quentin album, both live albums, are the ones that I revisited most. I mean, I've listened to probably, San Quentin in particular so many times, like hundreds of times. It's ridiculous. But I have listened to a lot of it, American trilogy and American kind of recordings of Rick Rubin and other bits. But those live recordings stand totally separate because Johnny Cash, when he's recording in the studio and you listen to him, it loses something. When he's live, you kind of, because he's having those conversations in between the songs and everything, there's an amazing amount of personality that comes across, and Johnny Cash comes across in those performances. And again, it's got that darkness to it, but it's got that light to it. He's a perfect kind of, contradictory character, like everyone is really, but he really weighs his contradictions out in the open and doesn't really know how to address them or to do with them, but he can't really run from them either. And yeah, he's an amazing artist, Johnny Cash is. And I think even for all his success, he's still vastly underrated from what he did, to be honest.
It always struck me when people classify Johnny Cash as country music. Of course, it's country music. I can see that it is, but it didn't sound like country music. Now, this, of course, might have to do with my own naivete or what I'm classifying country music as. But it is that gravelly darkness, where when he talks about killing or when he talks about crime, it feels lived in. Interestingly, it's not necessarily the truth. He never killed a man, but he was able to convince you that he was. And that's, I think, to me, what the fascination was, that you think you're listening to a particular type of music, however ill-informed you are, but the artist sort of transforms it into something unclassifiable. I think this is a question with biographies, is do we read biographies to find out facts about people's lives? And I'm not saying we should make things up, but I do also understand the tools of fiction being used in nonfiction for narrative purposes, because they're not trying to get to the facts as much as they're trying to get to the truth. And the truth might be more of a feeling that is stitched together. And so therefore, I think the craft of this biography is really what deserves to be celebrated, the tone and the approach of it.
I think that's fine, though. I think, because I'm a historian, as well, and checking facts and having more than one source is essential. But if you read in one biography and you're not going out and stating it as fact to everyone who comes along. And as long as you're not writing essays about Johnny Cash with only using one book.
This is something that always occurs to me, is I shouldn't be saying when Einstein went to Princeton, say when Jim Ottaviani shows him visiting, because I'm not actually talking about Einstein, I'm talking about a page in a comic.
And not only that, I think having the idea that you going into a comics biography or biography, it's not going to be an exhaustive account of someone's life. There is going to be a lot left out. The person is going to pick some things for pacing or dramatic or kind of, all these different factors. But I think most people would pick up a book and pick up a biography would know or understand, like Jim Ottaviani's books. I recently read the Imitation Game, and there's loads that's structured in that either didn't happen or was combined on one character, a combination of one character, all these stuff. But I know reading it that, this is done for the sake of the story and entertainment value and things like that. It's not an exhaustive biography. If I wanted that, then hopefully you'd have the brain enough to go, well, I need to read more than one book.
Right.
I want to know all about a person.
But I think even if you read 5, 6, 7 books, you'd still want to synthesize something into your head.
Yes.
And you'd still have to end up choosing, like most people have to do, of what to put in the frame and what to leave out of it.
Yeah.
Anytime you write a life story, even a fictional life story, you're picking which moments and which scenes, and any idea that something's going to be comprehensive and therefore 100% illustrative seems a little peculiar anyway. Yeah. It all seems to be stories. We have a couple more biographies on your list as well as mine, so it'll be interesting to keep an eye on what we think the approach these particular books are taking.
Guitarists, by the way.
2 guitarists. Oh, right. So are you looking at Scott Pilgrim as a solo musician, or was it more the story of the band with Steven and Kim? And
it's the band in it, but it's mainly a guitar garage band, isn't it,
Right. So we've gotten 2 books with guitarists.
Yeah. Let's see where we go next.
Over to you, Chris.
Blacksad, A Silent Hell. Now, for those of you who haven't read Blacksad before, Blacksad is an anthropomorphic detective in this fictionalized world of 1950s, 60s America. And essentially, it is this typical like detective film noir type drama going on with lots of intricate plots and, bad guys, good guys, dames, and all that type of thing. You know what it is. And I think actually Blacksad was one of the ones you put me onto as well, thinking about it. But Blacksad, I've loved all of the stories that I've read by Blacksad so far, and a lot of them involve, different crimes, murders, race wars, and, missing people. This book, though, is my favorite, and it wouldn't exist really without music, because the backdrop of this story and the backbone of this story is the jazz scene in New Orleans. And so when you open the book, you kind of are instantly finding yourself in a world where, there's a troubled artists, taking drugs, being exploited. There's, New Orleans jazz clubs with dancing women and bands and people just having a whale of a time. Instantly on the opening pages, you've got this New Orleans music scene and New Orleans jazz music scene. And the way I looked at this story, because again, people, mainly I reckon people would look at this book and not realize how central music is to it, because when you look at it, all of the main characters are involved in the music industry, whether they are managers, whether they're record producers, whether they are artists, whether they're writers or fans or family of those people. The backdrop itself is all around this kind of, hedonistic, musical world of jazz in New Orleans. I mean, just that page alone, just kind of with the record label in the back, La Chapelle Records, and even our record producer being this big hippo with a massive cigar. I love this because for me, this period, I've never fully understood why, and I don't really care to find out why. I've always been like obsessively attracted to this 1950s kind of, American LA detective film noir, Maltese Falcon, Big Sleep, Raymond Chandler type world. I mean, it's just always been something that has just dragged me in so effortlessly. The amount of times I've watched a lot of those films and Touch of Evil and all these other types of film noir films is ridiculous. I mean, it's one of the things I do to kind of just like relax and switch off. I went on a caravan trip not long ago and I had my laptop and just watched Big Sleep, Maltese Falcon, and a few others, just all just chilling out and so that is brilliant. But this puts that world together with the New Orleans jazz world and jazz scene in New Orleans. Whenever I was younger, I always kind of imagined, going to like Mexico and things like that. And as soon as I get off the plane, I hear like mariachi bands and I'm in Mexico, do you know what I mean? And New Orleans is similar in my mind. I'll get off and I'll hear jazz, I'll hear trumpets, I'll hear brass, I'll hear violins and bass and everywhere around me. And this book captures that backdrop really well, but it also showcases what still happens today, how the artist is kind of put upon. I mean, the music producer is massive and gigantic and overweight, and the artist is emaciated and tiny. And, and so it's got all these little, nuances to it. I mean, and even like the street musicians, like you get the street musicians like playing on homemade instruments and stuff like that. The music scene overall is so instrumental to this book that, I mean, you take it away and it loses its entire backdrop. Even if you ignore the fact that a lot of the characters are deeply in the music business, the backdrop itself relies on that musical scene and that musical culture, and whether it's good or bad, or whether it's, kind of partying or taking drugs and blacking out, it doesn't matter. It's all there. And then with a hefty bit of kind of voodoo and drug use mixed in as well. I mean, that's an amazing page, isn't it? I love that page. Because I always look at it and I always think how many hours he would have taken to do it. But this is the other thing, is you don't look at that page and see it as a static thing. You see the people moving, but you instantly know there's music and song and sound going on.
Yeah, you can hear that page. It's very loud.
Music in comics is that type of thing for me. It's really amazing. And the goat dancing is an amazing one as well. He's off his rocker on drugs while Blacksad is getting beat up elsewhere. But yeah, it's an amazing book. It is my favorite Blacksad book.
It's my favorite of the Blacksad stories as well.
It's definitely my favorite. But it highlights a lot of that, severe drug use as well. That was so prevalent on the scene, like on that jazz scene. And we'll get to that a bit later with one of my other books. But on that jazz scene, drug use was so overwhelmingly present. Heroin, cocaine, and marijuana and all that. They were going to town on that stuff. And this depicts it, with the artists like injecting themselves and then going out on stage and playing piano and stuff like that. And so it doesn't shy away from all of those types of things, really. I love it. It's a great book.
It is. Your point about the ambience of New Orleans is what I think of when I think of that book first. With A Silent Hell, it seems like it's there throughout, not just when there are people playing music on the page, but even those when Blacksad is getting beaten up and him sinking into the blue water. It's almost like you've created the comic to have this kind of sax. There's that one melancholy, like we've got it in slow motion, is like you can hear that. And that's something that I think is an astonishing achievement.
It is. Like, even when you look at that panel I showed you earlier, the record label, I mean, the way that it's framed and the way it's structured, that record company is like almost like the castle on the hill, overloading the whole of the city. Do you know what I mean?
Fantastic. This is something I forgot that we should be looking at as well. But you did show how Scott Pilgrim shows that guitar and the singing with those kind of jagged lines, and it has that almost garage. You can feel the roughness and the lo-fi sort of nature of the recording, and how the guitar jangle and the vocals are almost matching. What do you see in A Silent Hell that's interesting in the way that it depicts either singing or playing?
It's got that jagged box. The letters are very bold and it's got musical notes next to it. So it's kind of almost saying that this is the loudest thing. I mean, when you look at that compared to the lettering where they're talking,
Speech,
the talking is minuscule, but the music is massive. It's just because that's in a record shop where they're talking, obviously, it's just giving you the idea. Very subtle. I mean, I don't know whether you call it subtle or unsubtle, but for me, it's quite a subtle change. But having that gigantic lettering box, bubble there, bold letters, musical notes when everything else is tiny. It's just saying that you can't hear each other. The music is loud. And I think that's similar to what Scott Pilgrim is doing with those kind of long, big flowing lightning bolts almost coming out the instrument. It's showing that it's dominating and not a background sound. It's the main sound of the space. And so I think they both do that, but in slightly different ways.
Yes, this is something that you were mentioning right at the beginning, these kind of comics tropes that we can use in order to get access to what the comic wants to talk about. It's funny how we instantly know what it's supposed to be and why that's different from that, even though no one's really taught us that. No one really told us this means radio and this means speech.
Learned language, innit? A visual language of growing up. You know the things being bold and big, dominating, the things being little and smaller are being kind of, not dominated and going the other direction. So it's using what naturally humans should have, growing up. I think.
The Johnny Cash book, just to go backwards a little bit, one of the things that I forgot to mention was the speech. And the text in the speech balloons seems quite rigid, and I like the way that it's spaced. I think it works for that noir starkness. But what I really like is how that's contrasted to the singing. The way the singing is represented, where the bubbles, the shape itself changes. You have no tag to tell you where it's coming from. It's just sort of floating. But you've also got the pointed ends, which do give it a sort of beginning and an end. And then you've got the lettering itself sort of bend. And that stands in such distinction to the rigidity of the spoken word that this I found to be a simple but very effective trick in getting me to hear Johnny Cash's voice. And there is something about that which is like it's carving its space in for you. It's almost as if people's speech and talk to each other is much more prosaic, and it's the singing that has the real beautiful part of it. That was your second pick. Moving on to my second pick, also a biography. One question I forgot to ask you, Chris. Have you, looking at your list of comics, have you talked about these comics on your channel, or is it the first time you're talking about?
I think I have.
All of them?
I think 3 of them.
I think looking at my list, this book, my second pick, is the only one I've actually talked about on my channel. The other ones might have shown up on shelf tours, or I may have mentioned them by name. But I did have a live stream in which I talked about The Fifth Beatle, written by Vivek Tiwary and drawn by Andrew C. Robinson, but also with a section in which Kyle Baker provides the art. The Fifth Beatle is subtitled The Bryan Epstein Story and tells the story. It's a biography, but again, a selective biography. It's not from birth, although it does go to death, of the manager of the Beatles and the formation of the Beatles and their rise to success, and told from the point of view, and in this lovely art style, told from the point of view of the man who sort of brought them together. As well as his success, it kind of looks at the hidden life he had, because he was a closeted homosexual, because I mean there was no option at that time. It was illegal to be gay, and the kind of suffering or the kind of things he had to go through because of that stand in bold contrast to the kind of success, the phenomenal success that he achieved as the manager of the biggest band in the world. But what I loved about this book, and I have to admit that I stayed away from it because I had a misconception of what this book would be about. But what I loved about this book is how beautifully it captures not just that milieu of the Beatles making this music, but how it links who this man was to their success. I'm not very familiar with the nitty-gritty of the story of the Beatles. I had no idea who Bryan Epstein was. And this book, again, talking about what is fact and what is fiction, this book makes a very good case for saying that it was his spirit and his belief in these kids from Liverpool and his ability to go after something that he wanted while having this love and appreciation for music that's almost too pure in the business that he's in. Talking about record managers, and that's another thing I think that we'll see in our books is how is the record industry and how are the business bureaucrats depicted.
Depicts Brian Epstein pretty nicely, doesn't it?
He's in distinction to everything around him. So he meets the Colonel, who is Elvis's manager, and the Colonel is represented almost demonically with fangs and like ripping into the flesh over a dining table. It's just a dinner. But the venality and the poison, it's purposefully overblown. Although I think you would say that no, it's all true, everything they say about him.
Yeah, I would say it was true. But you said you misunderstood what it was, which is why you put off by it. What do you understand it to be then?
First of all, I always approach comics biographies with a little bit of skepticism. I think some of this comes from my childhood, in which a lot of comics were produced to be educational and to be good for you reading, almost remedial reading. So you got a lot of hagiographic sort of biographies, telling you about famous people, freedom fighters, and they're always presented in a very saintly sort of way because they're supposed to be for children and it's supposed to be like medicine. So I think I have a little bit of hangover, and I think it's only little by little that I've gotten to this kind of appreciation of a character with flaws and with contradictions, and looking at systems and situations, politics and history as being driving forces as well. When I was growing up, it was always one person against the world whose belief systems, changed everything. So when I heard that it was a biography of the man who made the Beatles, I thought it would be one of those things about the secret man you don't know, and the Beatles owed all their success to this person and he was pulling all the strings. I thought it would be that sort of almost like an expose. I'm very happy to say that I was wrong, that it is actually about a man who did change the world because of his faith or because of his belief in this musical group. But it also, I think, is showing you that sort of, I wouldn't say innocence, but that sort of purity or that sort of drive being such an aberration, being so unusual. And one of my viewers in that live stream did comment and say it was bound to happen. The Beatles could not stay together once Brian Epstein died. And although I don't know much about history, this book gives me a sense of why that would be. It's almost like here is the glue that was holding them together. And these personalities and these talented folks, they're not at the forefront of it at all. It's all Brian Epstein's story, but he also had this other life. So in many ways, he was one of the most public people, or he was representing the most public faces on the planet. And then there was all this hidden stuff and stuff that he couldn't say and things that he could never be accepted for that ran in parallel. And I think putting that together in this book is its true achievement, is those two sides coming together. Another thing that I think this comic does really well is it represents the Beatles as four young teenagers excellently, like better than I've seen in any media. They're joking around and they're pulling each other's legs, and their sort of disarming disregard for authority and people telling them how things are also creates the need for this manager to be able to massage that into that sort of worldwide business phenomenon. Is a balancing act that I didn't think I would be interested in until I read The Fifth Beatle. So I think it's a fantastic comic. It's a fantastic biography, but it also takes this approach to music of having a clear-eyed view of how nasty, and just like you were talking about with Silent Hell, how nasty things can be, but also presenting a sort of unique spirit that somehow can triumph against that, or at least for a while make some headway.
And again, it looks like an amazing book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm definitely kind of going to check that out at some point because the art alone looks stunning.
Yeah, the art, the colors, they're fantastic. The page compositions can be equally fairy tale-like and quite stark. It never becomes that noir starkness. It's always got this day glow sort of vibrancy to it. There's always, even in the darkest scenes, there's this either the pink or the blues will really stand out. So it's got that sort of three-dimensional fullness to it, but it's also cartoony. So it's not photorealism. And then, of course, there is that section that Kyle Baker does, Chaos in the Philippines. So it's that particular chapter of the Beatles' life. And that section is drawn by Kyle Baker in full-on Plastic Man mode. It's brilliant. And it's a lovely, not just a bonus, but it's a lovely thing to have in the middle of this story, which is otherwise in a very different art style.
It works so well. It does. It works really well.
It really does. Now I really want to see a sort of comics version of Hard Day's Night or something like that done by Kyle Baker. It would be really good. But that's my second pick.
Number three for me was a no-brainer. And this was the one that popped into my head instantly